Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast on emerging doctrine and the Army's vision of warfare. Hello, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Becker. I'll be hosting today's episode, Training Multidomain Operations, where we'll focus on FM 70 training. We welcome the 4th Infantry Division and Fort Carson Command Team, Major General David Doyle, and Command Sergeant Major Alex Kupratty. General Doyle currently serves as the Commanding General of 4ID and has a career filled with operational experiences around the world. He also served as both Commander, Operations Group, and Commanding General of the Joint Readiness Training Center, JRTC. Sergeant Major Kupratty currently serves as the Division Command Sergeant Major of 4ID. He spent much of his career training and deploying with the 75th Ranger Regiment. He has served in leadership positions within both Special Operations and conventional units, from team leader to Command Sergeant Major. We also welcome back to the show Colonel Retired Rich Creed, our director here at the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate. He joins us to bring both a doctrinal perspective and operational experiences during his Army career. Welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Thank
you for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa.
Fantastic to see you again. I think the last time we crossed paths was in Afghanistan, and Rich, it's wonderful to see you as always, an icon, both in our Army as well as here at Fort Leavenworth.
It's good to see you, sir, and great to meet the Sergeant Major. It was a real honor.
As we look at FM 70 today, we will focus on some principles of training, talk about training for multi-domain operations, and then examine the role of senior leaders in prioritizing training. So let's start our conversation by focusing on the principles of training as found in FM 70. So there's 9 principles, and I want to focus on the first 2. They're directed at commanders and NCOs. So the first principle is commanders are the primary trainers. The second principle is non-commissioned officers train individuals, crews, and teams. Advise commanders on all aspects of training. So I'm curious, what are your expectations of commanders as primary trainers from company level to yourself, sir, at the division? And how should NCOs be advising commanders differently, or maybe the same at different levels?
Well, thanks for the opportunity to provide some thoughts on that. What I would share with you, I had a pretty useful understanding of 7.0 in its original form and the different ways it was developed over the years, but it really didn't hit home to me until I was a brigade combat team commander that the prioritization from your commander makes a lot of difference in that which you're going to train on and that which you're going to accept some risk and perhaps, I wouldn't say let go by the wayside, but focus less energy on it. And Major General, then Steve Townsend, pulled me into his office at one point and explained to me that he did not recognize as a brigade combat team how I was supporting his division priorities. I thought my career light was blinking because he made it very clear that I needed to correct that and needed to ensure that I was in alignment with the division. And so that, this 2nd Brigade Combat Team wasn't off on its own FTX. It was part of the 10th Mountain Division and therefore had to be able to service certain requirements that he owed to the 18th Airborne Corps commander. And so he made that very clear, and that really stuck with me. So the prioritization of training as driven by a commander's understanding of what his requirements are to satisfy the needs of whether it's the Joint Force or the Army or the higher level of command became really imprinted in how I try to do business. And so what I've told my brigade commanders, and I think we communicate this with the battalion command teams as well, is, hey, do that which your commander has prioritized first, and then do those supporting tasks that will enhance the roles and responsibilities that you have to achieve the mission. Our doctrine does a great job of outlining that you don't prioritize metal and you don't pick and choose those things, but when we're in a resource-constrained environment, a commander's vote has to be pretty substantial, because that transfer of risk is only done well when it's part of a system, when it's outlined, when it's briefed, when it's shared. Otherwise, you find that you've got folks who are training to different levels of proficiency in different areas, and you as a senior commander or as a commander of different echelons can't make good judgments on how to employ them. So the non-commissioned officers, my assessment are involved in making sure that those training plans are tied to reality, that those training plans can actually be accomplished within the time and the resources as driven.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yeah, I think, the principle number 2 is the same. You hit it. I don't think it changes at all at echelon. I think the advice you provide commanders is commensurate with your experience, and I've seen it change over time. And really, the brigade level is at one time where I realized that the relationships that I built inside the brigade and outside of the brigade paid dividends, and how I was able to communicate with the commander as to the true status of the formations. And that takes an NCO to be present all the time, to have those conversations with the battalion commanders, company commanders, and kind of shape and help them understand where truly their formations are, and then make adjustments if need be.
Yeah, we had a recent experience. We were in the midst of a gunnery with one of our units, and we had apportioned a certain amount of time. We'd given them the appropriate amount of resources, and they were out executing. And Command Sergeant Kupratty went out there to take a look at the training to see how things were going. I was receiving reports and kind of checking in on things indirectly through the staff, but he went out there physically to see what was taking place and came back and said, well, they're going to need more time. They're going to need more ammunition, because while they may be meeting the basic benchmarks of qualification, they are not mastering that which we expect them to do. So we are reapportioning the division's priorities. We realigned some resources from other units, and we enabled this unit to finish to a reasonable standard instead of a minimal standard. And the only reason that was able to happen is because Sergeant Major was able to get out there with his experience and his understanding of what the real requirements were and translate that back into the training model.
Yeah, so non-commissioned officer corps is your directed telescope. I mean, they're telling you what's really happening down where the rubber meets the road. Because to your point about with Cheryl Townsend, I mean, and what a great leader he was. We love to have him in TRADOC. This 2 levels up, 2 levels down actually means something. I mean, that's doctrine for a reason. And to be able to carry out the commander's intent means you need somebody that's extending that commander's intent into the actual sinews of the formation. I think that's what the NCOs do. But if you get out of whack in terms of, hey, we're training to do what? If the sergeant major hadn't gone down there and found that, then there was no way for you to ever find out whether your actual intent was being met. Hey, we met the minimal gates. Well, I'm not interested. Minimal gates is good, but we can be better than that. But without the sergeant major, I don't know how you would have even know.
I would not have. And it would have caused those soldiers to, I think, lose confidence and maybe not have as much trust in the training methodology, much less their leaders who were training them. And so it gave us a chance to reaffirm that we have a standard for a reason, because we want those soldiers to survive on the battlefield. We want them to accomplish the mission. We want them to be ready for the next fight. And so I think it was a really good example of how the non-commissioned officer corps should shape training, both in planning and execution.
And it sounds like you kind of lay the groundwork for not having a check-the-box mentality.
Well, candidly, I think the junior officers who were there may have felt like there was some degree of pressure to get to the next gate, to move on to the next station. And when Sergeant Major talked to them and said, hey, what are we trying to do here? The light bulb goes off. And then they recognize, okay, this isn't just good enough. We have to be, like I said, the master of this task. And so do you want to describe the interaction that you had with those individuals?
Absolutely, sir. And, we talk about the A-STEP training model quite a bit, and we've become masters of number 6. We execute it, and we're really in a rush to get to that point. And when we look at 7, when we evaluate training, conduct those AARs, we seem to think that that's something that happens way after the fact, when we should be taking the opportunities during training to reset. And those are some of the conversations we have. It's like, how do we think things are going? What do we plan to do? Is it going the way we planned it? Well, no, it's not. I was like, well, what can we do now? We don't need to sit here through another 24 hours of this. Let's adjust now. We might have to order, resource you a little bit better now, but we can change, the trajectory of where the formation is going. And that, they took that very well, and we adjusted, and then I think that formation is much better for it now.
But it really goes back to a fuller, deeper understanding of training management. And I think for a while, our Army is trying to hone that skill, because my sense is like Sergeant Major said, we put a lot of step 6 on the calendar, but we don't build in step 5, step 4, step 3, step 2, step 1 in on the calendar so it's visible, so that folks know that those steps in the ASAP training model are as important, in fact, more so than the actual execution. And so we have to do a better job as senior leaders to educate people how to apportion time wisely. And then, in essence, as I indicated with General Townsend, take the appetite suppressant on those things that are peripheral, so that if you're going to be really good at X, that you walk the dog all the way back to the first portion of the training rather than just arrive at the point where you think you can execute. And so we owe that to our leaders. We owe it through our professional military education. We owe it through a better study of the doctrine and the materials that are already out there, which outline this exceptionally well. And one of the things we're doing, or at least trying to do at the 4th Infantry Division, we call it a P-week methodology. I'm sure we stole it from the Ranger Regiment. I'm sure they stole it from somebody else. But a P1 week is for training. A P2 week is for recovery. And you can't have all P1 weeks back to back to back to back, because if you don't allow yourself some degree of training and some degree of preparation, you just continuously put yourself in a do loop of minimalistic achievement. So we're working on that. I don't know that we have it all the way figured out, but we're trying to institutionalize it with a degree of emphasis in our semi-annual training briefs and company training meetings.
Yeah, I love that. I think of how many times there was a week on the calendar for recovery, but it really wasn't. That was, hey, get to the next.
That's right.
Next training event, next whatever it was.
Yeah, General Votel would call it prexury. Said you got to avoid prexury. And what is prexury? Preparation, recovery, and execution all in the same week. Mm-hmm. And some organizations at a division level, you could probably have all three of those things happen somewhere in your formation. But if you're a brigade and you're doing prexury, that means your sustainment enterprise is probably full out. Mm-hmm. And if you're at a battalion and you're trying to do that, forget about it. You don't have the bandwidth to be able to do all three of those things in any given week. You really do have to focus so that you can accomplish whatever the task is, whether it's preparation, execution, or recovery, with a degree of supervision.
I think it's the beauty of the gated training strategies, right? I mean, we'll take tank gunnery or Bradley gunnery or aviation gunnery. You've got a stair-step approach, and if you hand wave any aspect of that, you're putting the premier training event that's supposed to show competence and, if not mastery, at risk, right? And so it's really hard to hit the machine gun engagements on Table 8 or Table 12 if you didn't hit them in Table 5. And if you can't let people get past Table 5, or you're going to have that problem, because it continually gets harder and harder. They used to, in the old days, I mean, Table 7 was always harder standard-wise. It really wasn't, but it was treated as that, because if you could get through that, then Table 8 wasn't so bad. And then you'd have to take a break, get yourself together before you start moving to section and platoon gunnery. But that, and you get a sense sometimes that people do feel rushed to get to the premier thing, to the capstone thing, as opposed to all the prep work that goes in.
Yeah, we find sometimes that the maneuverists, the ones that actually do some of the live fire high-end training, forget the apparatus that has to support them needs training as well. And so we have to discipline that portion of the system too, because if you have tanks, Bradleys, Strikers that can't make it to the field to do any sequence of the table, you're not going to ever achieve proficiency, because you're going to be doing it in a haphazard way, or hot bunking vehicles, or doing things that are out of context with what we want to be able to do to build confidence. And so we, at the brigade and the division level, are trying to also incorporate P-week methodologies for our sustainment enterprise, in addition to the folks that are executing the more traditional forms of training.
Sergeant Major, you were talking about, you had a little chat with some lieutenants. So I kind of have a question about that. Brings me back to my lieutenant days, when my first platoon sergeant for about a month, and then the second one came in, Sergeant First Class Swisher. And I remember this was his first time being a platoon sergeant. He was like, hey, ma'am, I was told I'm supposed to come in and I'm your teacher or, advisor, and that's kind of my job. So what's your take on, or how do you coach senior NCOs to advise those officers?
That's a good question. And well, first and foremost, establish that relationship, and any command relationship, whether it's the company, battalion, or brigade, starts with solid foundation of counseling and delineating responsibilities and what your commander expects you to do, understanding his intent. Back to the communication piece. As a senior NCO, you are the conduit of information. You're the one who takes intent, kind of chews it and puts it in the language that the junior enlisted can understand. So first and foremost is establishing the relationship with your commander, so you have the trust and confidence. You have to be able to show that you're a master of your craft. So when you do come back, and then you look at the second part, which is the most important, and what I think is, you advise the commander on the strengths and weaknesses of the formation. Then you have the backing. You have demonstrated that. The other piece of that is they're responsible for developing the future battalion commanders, future brigade commanders, and I understand that. When I was first told that, I was like, well, that's a big rock to carry. But it goes beyond just the 25-meter fight. It's 50, 300 meters, and you're developing future leaders. So it's we start that understanding intent. Translating that, how do you communicate that at echelon? You have to be flexible and agile in how you communicate. There's so many differences in generational gaps, and people understand differently.
Yeah,
so you have to find a way to reach down to the lowest level, and I think that's the challenge, but it's quite doable.
I want to go back to those principles. So the first one is just talking about commanders. The second one talking about NCOs. So what I was finding in FM 70 is how integrated, the commander role and the NCO role is. So is there a line or not a line between commanders as primary trainers and NCOs training individuals, crews, and small teams?
Yeah, my estimate is there's not. When I've been down to see effective battalion training meetings and company training meetings, the non-commissioned officers who are giving voice to the things that can be done, things that should be done, the things that ought to be done are the ones that give commanders options. And then commanders make decisions, and they're ultimately held accountable for those decisions. But when they're informed by that rich dialogue, which I think Sergeant Major alluded to is really product of trust, you get a better product on the output end. And so I don't know that there's a line. There are responsibilities. I mean, there are, in essence, terms of reference, who is ultimately got to slap their name on the training schedule, but the degree to which the interaction happens in a fulsome way will drive whether or not you're going to get a useful product or you're going to end up with something that's either ill-conceived or almost too difficult to execute because nobody applied the realism quotient into what was being put on the calendar.
Yeah, no, I agree with the CG there. I don't think there is a line. I think the commander is overall responsible. And there's two things, really. One, he's ultimately all individual crew and small teams build up the collective training. And at the end of the day, he's the one that certifies 2 levels down. So he's going to come up to his level at some point. And the earlier he's involved, it's excellent. And really, the second one, he'll prioritize based on the NCO's feedback when I come back and say, hey, sir, I know we're in this glide path to reach CALFEXs by this day, but I want you to come look at it, see what I'm seeing. I just don't think we're at the proficiency level that we need to move to the next step. So he can do that if he just, allows himself to be removed from the process. And I think it's great. NCOs and soldiers like to see their commanders being part of the training, especially at the individual and crew levels.
And we do an awful lot of work when we have the opportunity to set aside time for individual skills training with our E3B, the work of mastery of small unit or individual skills to see what the progressions ought to be. And you talked about a gated training strategy. Well, it's not just on gunnery. It's on all these things that build upon themselves to be able to produce a platoon live fire. So I want our younger leaders to see how it all fits together, because then they can, through their experience, make more realistic judgments on the resourcing requirements, and then basically build out a plan that achieves the purpose for their higher headquarters. And so we're all facilitating each other instead of working across purposes.
Yeah, I mean, culture is not inherited, it's transmitted.
Yeah.
And so we have to model it, right? And when you're in unison, you saw what right looks like, that sticks with you forever. Just like seeing what right doesn't look like says, okay, well, I'm not going to go that direction when it's my opportunity to be in charge. So you can remember which commanders and non-commissioned officers set a good example in that regard throughout your career. I mean, you can name them by names. Lisa named some already, but I think that's a powerful thing. Example is a powerful thing.
I really want to talk about multi-domain operations. So let's shift our conversation to training, specifically multi-domain operations. So I have a two-part question for you. I know that both you, General Doyle and Sergeant Major, have extensive combat experience during the Global War on Terror, GWOT. So how have you personally switched your mindset or shifted your mindset from those counterinsurgency operations and those experiences to embracing multi-domain operations? And then the second piece of that is, what advice do you have to give to senior NCOs and field grade officers, like my generation specifically, who I grew up in the GWOT era, but now I'm a leader, hopefully taking command soon, and I'm expected to train my organization in a very different environment, very different threat.
Well, I'm glad you finished with that word, because that drives everything, threat. In essence, an appreciation for what we have to do with large-scale combat operations has to come with an appreciation for that threat. And what the adversaries will bring to the battlefield, or from crisis to conflict, is what's driving our change. We are dealing with a different type of threat. And we have been a little hesitant to get back on board with some of the fundamentals of understanding the threat, which then drive the doctrine, which then drive our operations. I remember a time when we were just talking about this not too long ago. We would be at a rifle range, and my squad leaders would have a deck of cards with all the threat weapon systems and the threat vehicles, and they would put the card down, and you got your one opportunity to get that vehicle identification correct. And if you didn't, you were doing push-ups, or you were going to do some kind of measure to reinforce the fact you should have known that in the first place. So now that we have a different appreciation for what the threats are, we've got to develop our capabilities to meet that. And this takes the whole of Army. When you talk about what the Army Futures Command is doing and what we have with our Material Command and how we're trying to change the big ticket items. And then at division and below level, we're starting to figure out, the blocking and tackling that happened before the Global War on Terrorism. Those type of skill sets have to get revisited. I don't think we walked away from them. I don't think we ever gave up on shoot, move, and communicate, but we didn't do it at scale, and we didn't do it with the same degree of respect for an adversary that could match some of those skill sets or some of those capabilities. And so that's where I think we are right now in training, is being more respectful of the magnitude, the scope, the scale, and potentially the endurance of an adversary. And the more we enable ourselves to respect the threat, I think the better we are going to be at developing the aggregated capabilities that are going to exist on a large-scale combat operations battlefield.
So I don't want to put words into your mouth.
No, go ahead.
But, for my generation, would you say first step, understand the threat?
Without a doubt.
Get to pulling out the card and knowing the card deck?
Yeah, the deck of cards.
We have those now.
Yeah, we do.
The
Yeah.
G2's got some.
Yeah,
And they have them in digits as well. I mean, if you're a digital native, you can pull up your phone and look at that stuff. No, the threat drives everything else. And, when we want to train for purpose, we don't want to train for, just a generic operating environment. We want to train for what we think is realistic. And so you whittle away some of those things that are unlikely, and you focus on that which is the most likely. And our doctrine tells us to be prepared to go into any type of environment, but prioritize that which you think you're going to face. And so I'm glad to see a lot of what we get out of the Center for Army Lessons Learned get translated back to the CTCs, which drives the way that their OPFOR operate, and then it allows the units to deal with something that's more realistic as opposed to generic. And there's always risk in specificity. If you get it wrong, you're probably going to regret that. But it also allows you to pivot from a known point as opposed to just making some stuff up. So I think the threat drives what we want to train against in large-scale combat operations.
Yeah, and one of the things I will add to that before I start kind of on my experiences in the coin fight is, understanding the capabilities, across all 5 domains. And that's what we have started to go through in academics, what's available there, and understanding that some of those capabilities will probably be found at core level or above. I think when the time comes for our senior leaders to have the ability to potentially leverage some of those capabilities, they need to understand what those are. But back to the shift from coin to multi-domain operations, I think over during the time during multiple deployments, we benefited from a very mature training environment, a very mature theater, right? I think you can count on your logistical lines pretty much set. Our sustainment and maintenance was pretty good. If you're overwhelmed, you're sure to have a bunch of civilian contractors to help you out as you continue to go out and persecute the enemy. I think largely uncontested our ability to sustain ourselves. Personally, when I look at it and how our approach to training is kind of driving that into the mind of our NCOs. You're not going to have any of that. You have the pacing and acute threat from both China and Russia with similar capabilities, some of which we may not even know. But really, there's no supremacy in the air in the future. We're almost equal. And, when they have EW capabilities or cyber capabilities that can target your tactical communications, GPS jamming, some basic things that we habitually relied on, we go back to the basics. And, the SMA talks about being brilliant at the basics, right? When we talk about warfighting, it's doing the small things right. And a lot of those things have atrophied over time. We're looking at your basic land navigation. We just had this conversation with the FORSCOM CSM, and then fieldcraft. And it's just things that we haven't done in quite a while. So going back to that and rebluing ourselves, I think is really step one as we change our mindset into the MDO fight.
I think there's this other piece, right? And we don't always talk about it, but in many ways, all the conveniences that we enjoy from being accustomed to fight a certain way against certain types of opponents who could not do things to us that we could do to them. So they could contest us on land at the small unit level from time to time. But the setting the expectations you talked about, Sergeant Major, in terms of helping people visualize why this is important. I mean, nobody does that better than the non-commissioned officer corps. Says, well, why do I got to dig this hole every time I finish moving for the day? And why am I continuously improving my battle position and camouflaging myself and concealing myself? Well, because if they see you, they're going to drop a battery 6 on your head, right? And their HPTL starts with groups of 5 people and more, right? I mean, which is very different than any of us experienced. I mean, what's the heaviest bombardment we ever had on a FOB? 6 or 7 rockets pop in? Not 6 hours of artillery coming. The last time our Army faced that was probably, sometime in Vietnam, rarely, probably in Korea in 1953. But there's no way to visualize that, right? How do you visualize something that you've never done? Well, I think we do this through the professional development program, that we explain what that's like from a historical standpoint. So there's an education piece to the training, because if you can explain the why and make it serious, then that sense of urgency is all of a sudden communicated.
General Camera would always talk about you're not going to have to convince anybody to dig a fighting position after they see the impact of a round on one of their buddies. And having gone through 8 days of bombardment of the Haditha Dam to see what 152 rounds can do to even concrete, you recognize the requirement for dispersion, for camouflage, for electromagnetic spectrum controls, because that was not against a very sophisticated enemy. That was just against an enemy that had a lot of rounds. So each of those experiences have to get replicated in training. And it's very challenging. Having been in the CTCs, the obligation that they have to compel people to understand what the realistic environment is going to be, it doesn't always translate And yet we've seen in Ukraine, we've seen in these other locations, the impact of what you just described, massed artillery. And we know that the rest of our adversaries have that same capability and precision strikes with hypersonics and some of these other capabilities. So you do recognize that until hopefully we're able to translate that in a meaningful way, folks are just a little bit hesitant to do all that work because it's not easy.
So before we switch over to talking 4ID and your trading specifically there, Sir General Doyle, I have a question for you. So look back at the past. You were both COG and CG at GRTC. If you had the latest version of FM30, where we're talking multi-domain operations, would you train differently if you were back as the COG or the CG?
First of all, this is a phenomenal question and a soul-searching one at that, because I wonder if I missed opportunities to help folks be better prepared for what Rich was just describing there. Thankfully, Dave Gardner and Matt Hardman, who are there at the Joint Readiness Training Center right now, have read 3.0, and they are doing a fantastic job of creating an environment where multi-domain awareness is a thing. And so what I would say I wish I would have done had I read this is done a better job of making the brigade combat team that was in the dirt the customer for a whole host of different effects that are provided by other entities. And we were starting to do that. We had a pretty decent understanding of what a division did to help set conditions for a brigade combat team. But we hadn't really harnessed everything that you would expect to come from space, cyber, EW. Now, not all that gets focused in the close area. I mean, not all that is going to be provided for a brigade combat team's exclusive use. I mean, we were breaking patterns by just pulling the aviation away from it because the brigade commander grew to expect that they would have helicopters at their immediate beck and call. But allowing them to be more of a customer so that when the effect of convergence was achieved, that they knew they had to produce the land domain effect because that was the window. That was the one time they were going to have the opportunity. That would be, I think it is now, and they're doing a pretty good job of it, the powerful recognition of what we're saying in our multi-domain operations, where you don't have relative advantage at every single time. You don't have relative superiority at every single moment of the day. And when those windows come, the land component has to be ready, postured, synchronized, and given the impetus to perform in that fleeting window of opportunity. And how do you do that and still maintain the training proficiency of all the other tasks that a brigade has to do? That's a pretty good challenge. I'm glad Dave Gardner is working on that. That would be more useful, I think, for our brigade commanders to do now, because that's what they're going to have to do in the battlefield. They're not the show. They're providing a capability to the joint force at a place and time that matters. And sometimes they're going to have to survive. They're going to have to keep themselves available for use rather than being the only thing that's important on the battlefield.
Yeah, that's a big shift.
Yeah, every single BCT that went out was the main effort. They had all their toys, they had everything they needed, and they were told, fix this. Now, I don't even think divisions are in that boat. I mean, having watched the warfighters, the most resource-jealous person on the planet is a corps commander. And they're taking everything away from the divisions to be able to shape the battlefield, because they know if they shape the battlefield in a certain way, then the division can execute the close fight with a reasonable COFOM, with a reasonable expectation for success. And so I think corps commanders, JTF commanders, maybe Army commanders are going to be the ones that have to make difficult decisions on when it is that they apportion resources back to the tactical unit, which the division is, or when they keep those assets, resources, and tools, the MDO capabilities at their disposal to achieve effects.
And there's that whole human dimension of that, and guess who gets stuck explaining all that to, hey, we're not the priority guys, so we're the economy of force, and we've got to hold this, and, life isn't good.
Yeah, we're all looking at this Armada right now.
Because they get to the great job of having to explain why things are so bad.
No, absolutely. And I think that's going to be the challenge, particularly to the ones who were in the GWAT, who had the freedom of maneuver and who had all this, exquisite capabilities, at their reach. How do we go back? How do you change that mindset? And so we were able to do that. The war didn't just start with logistical lines, firmly planted. We had to start. It was a semi-permissive environment. We didn't benefit from all the things we did 20 years later. We're striking to develop. The intelligence was never perfect. So we will get there. I'm very, very sure. I'm positive for that.
So continue talking about training specifically in your division. What are you seeing that's the same amount of training that we've done in the last 20 years? So like kind of this sustains maybe that we have been doing. And then how are you shifting and what's different about training as we're doing multi-domain operations?
Yeah. And the Army goes through cycles of resource scarcity all the time for training. I mean, Rich, you probably remember this in the 90s when we didn't have ammunition and you kind of get out there and your soldiers are saying bang, bang. And it was the most frustrating thing in the world because we thought we're the United States Army. We're, the superpower on the planet. I can't get blank ammunition for my soldiers to be able to do just the fundamentals, the basics of fire and movement. And then we come into a time of plenty and we're able to do all those things in a bag of chips. We can do fantastic training, realistic training. We build mount sites that have all kinds of effects. And the nation and the Army really invested. And so I think we're maybe another inflection point where resource scarcity is going to be significant, but it's not so much in materiel as it is in people and where we are with our sessions and where we are with human capital. So I appreciate the opportunity to look at the R-Struck and see where the Army's going and how we're going to compensate for some of those deficiencies. But for us, going back to what you asked about, how are we doing training? What's the same? What's changed? We're making pretty good use of the folks that we have to get them sets and reps, but it's maybe at a different grade plate than we would hope. And I think that's going to manifest itself a little bit more as time goes on until we regain our footing with our personnel status. So, you look at half glass empty perspective, you're saying, oh my gosh, I've got staff sergeants who are platoon sergeants and, either follow one drill that follows. Glass half full is look at all the experience these staff sergeants are getting, because if we ever do refill our ranks, and I think we will, then we're going to have a lot of experience coming up that would have otherwise just taken more time to matriculate. So it's something, what do you think about all that?
No, I think you're spot on, sir. That is exactly, I think about the only different thing we would do is just how we're developing our NCOs now. There was a time when we used to do the one-up drill as part of training, but that is the norm now, and it's not training, it's for real, and now we have platoon sergeants being first sergeants, and the majority of our operations, sergeant major positions are filled by master sergeants. So really identifying what the institutional domain is teaching nowadays, identifying the gaps and how we build our professional development systems, whether it's a team, squad, first sergeant level, to make them more, make them a more professional force and make them successful in their position. That is single-handedly the one thing that we're focusing on right now.
Can you give an example of what a gap that you're seeing right now that you're really focused on?
Oh, absolutely. Let's just take, for example, a company. You have like if you have all platoon sergeants or E7s as your platoon sergeants, now a first sergeant position becomes open, and it's just not a first sergeant to put there. So the natural thing is to fleet up your most senior sergeant first class, the one with the most potential and the ability to lead that formation. So it takes a while before we can get this person into MLC. So, what we discussed with the battalion and brigade CSMs is like, what can we do? What are the things that we believe a company first sergeant needs to know to survive that first gunfight, right? Using that term is what makes them successful, what makes them value added to that company commander. Because now we're putting a guy who shouldn't be ready or potentially doesn't have all the experience necessary to be successful. So
I have a question about that. So we were talking about, like my generation, NCOs and officers. who grew up in the GWAT. Do you think that maybe glass half full, that you have more open-minded NCOs who are not stuck in the rut of GWAT, that you can shape a little bit more?
We do. We do. We have a little bit of both, but for the most part, I think we have a lot more flexible and more innovative NCOs. Everybody tends to sometimes look at some of the negative aspects of leading up an NCO too quickly, but I think really not necessarily an NCO or even our junior NCOs and our soldiers. Their very DNA is just embedded with technology that we've never been exposed to as I was growing up. So there's goodness and there's greatness in that. You just gotta know how to leverage it because they're more open to change. And again, much more flexible than I think the NCOs back in my day were.
The challenge, though, is, go back to our discussion about how do we do training management? How do we make things systematized if our leaders are not as experienced with the way the process is designed to work? While they may be innovative, they may miss steps, they may miss opportunities. And so the more senior leaders, and General Garrett used to say this all the time, do not take for granted the fact that everybody knows that which you know in your formation. And you may be the expert on a given topic. And so for training management, the experts may not be company commanders. The expert may not be the S3. The expert may be the battalion commander. And that battalion commander just can't take for granted that every single element below him or her knows what to do for, the progression of their organization. So the onus then is, if we're going to pleat up people who are innovative, creative, and really willing to push the envelope, then let's make sure they're equipped with the right tools. And so I think this is the dialogue you've had with Sergeant Holland about where's the institutional responsibility versus where's the field's responsibility to make that training stick.
That's right. Yeah, the operational experiences. That's where the part two comes in, and that's a great point with the ASIP training model, sir. It's step two. We forget about that. We take for granted. We make assumptions that our leaders, and we did that for the longest time. I typically say the GWAT is, to blame for the CONOP training. Here's the one slider. I was like, okay, let's talk about that. But I think that training and certifying leaders, it's more and more critical nowadays, especially when that leader has not been prepared to assume that position. So that's what we're spending most of our time on now.
I think, I don't know what you all think, but it seems to me if we get our culture right, our culture about training, then you can fleet people up within that culture because they understand, all right, I don't know everything, but the culture says I go learn it. The culture says I'm listening. The culture says I'm going to find answers. The culture says, hey, this is the process. So guess what? We're all going to discover, learn our way through this.
Yeah, and General Rainey, before I took command of the 4th Infantry Division, made some very emphatic points to me and really emphasized that if I only did one thing during my entire tenure, if I accomplished some degree of leader development and leader preparation, that the Army would be in better shape. And so, based on his very emphatic guidance, we worked together as a staff and modified a tool that I had used in my brigade command experience we call it the Ivy Arc of leader professional development. And the first thing that we focused on was culture, to make sure that we, within the 4th Infantry Division, understood our history, understood what made us distinct and special, and then ensured that we were connected to the Army's values and the Army culture so that, like General Townsend, we do what our boss said first. And so we've been working diligently on that. And our next arc, which overlaps with the culture arc, is on innovation of thought and how do we understand our capabilities and our tools. We're trying to get better on data. We're going to try to get better on our process. And then the last arc, which overlaps with innovation, is lethality and how do we fight. So we developed a culture. We have worked on our tools, how we're going to operate, and then we harness it to kill the enemy. And those arcs are intended to ensure that our leaders are prepared to go through the right steps, seek help when they don't have it, do self-study, learn what is available to them from a doctrinal standpoint or from an education standpoint. And then, by the way, we hold ourselves accountable to be value added to the 3rd Armored Corps or ForceCom to produce results at the end of the day. So it's amazing. I mean, not amazing. It's not surprising. You talk about culture as being foundational to training. It's really one of those things where if we get that wrong, it doesn't matter what kind of doctrine we have. It doesn't matter how much we invest in our equipment. It's all for naught.
I want to talk about that innovation piece, sir, because
Sure.
I've been hearing about creativity in some of our episodes on other podcasts that I've listened to, seen some recent articles published by Army leaders about creativity. So, doctrine doesn't say creativity, talks creative thinking, talks innovation. So those are found in FM 622 and ADP 622. But I really think that creativity, innovation is also kind of implied within multi-domain operations. When you're thinking about the tenets and imperatives of 3.0, I think that requires creativity. If you go back to the principles of training, if we listed them all out, I think that implies some creativity and innovation. So I'd love to hear more about your thoughts and how you're creating the culture of creativity.
Well, the interesting thing, Rich, you talked about the gated training models that put the science of training into being, because you learn what a service danger zone is. You learn what the max effective range of a weapon system is. You learn the consumption rates, both for fuel and ammunition. You learn what movement rates are during different periods of darkness over different types of terrain. So those gated steps that are formalized and in many cases, really well adopted by our Army are important. And we spend a lot of time on those types of training events, making sure we are rigorous and thorough and well educated in the science of our profession of arms. We often miss out on some of the art involved in training when we don't give people the chance to fail, when we don't give people the chance to try things out, when we set conditions that are so restrictive that there's only one way of accomplishing the purpose. And it may feel good to watch a company battery troop get through the steps and say, oh, you're ready to go to the next thing. But that organization may not have learned anything collectively. They did some things and they don't really understand the why. And so we are trying to find ways to give more freedom for folks to explore safely, mind you, but different ways of accomplishing the purpose. And we do that with a lot of force on force. We do that a lot with the situational training exercise. We do that a lot where you build in enough time that you can execute a mission in a couple different ways and see which one worked best. By doing that, you invite a lot more requirements for time. And so we have to take an appetite suppressant on all the other things that would be great to do because we just can't afford it. Not and do sustainment, not and do maintenance, not and allow people to have some time off. So it's again a risk discussion. If we want to get people to think, we want people to interact with a live OPFOR, we want them to be challenged, then you can't do it and get everything done in 270 days. You're going to have to peel some things off. And I have to tell my boss, sir, here's some things we're not going to do because I'm going to allow my leaders this chance to figure some stuff out that they wouldn't do in a live fire progression.
That's it's spot on. Kind of what you say when we train to fail, not to fail, but everything we build ends up in hey, we're winning, we accomplish this. And when you're talking about the principles in multi-echelon training and training as a combined arms force, that's what we're trying to do right now, especially as we go into lethal IV, is how do we overwhelm the force enough so it causes them to exercise TTPs and SOPs that normally they haven't, to identify gaps. What do we need? Do we need quadcopters? How do we move our casualties? Is there some kind of robot? Is there some kind of vehicular move, gadget that we can control to minimize the exposure of medics? When you talk about creativity, I think really putting type of rigorous events on the calendar is what's going to push our formations to kind of say, oh my gosh, we need this. Hey, how about how we looked into this? That's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's really what the CTCs are designed to do, put pressure on every single system within an organization to find where the cracks are, and then you see some really creative stuff at that point. We're trying to do that to a smaller scale without the same degree of resourcing and, the freedom that the CTC has. We're trying to do that at the local level at 4th ID and Fort Carson.
I'd throw two ideas out, sir. The first point, though, is there's always people that we talk about innovation, they always want to think outside the box. Problem is they don't have a box. Like, they don't even know what the box is, much less have a bunch of dots inside it, right? And so if your box is filled with dots, and we'll just, for argument's sake, you can talk about training management or you could talk about doctrine, right, as a portfolio. If you're full of dots, you've got an almost infinite number of combinations that you could put together there, even inside the box, before you even need to start worrying about getting outside the box. The other piece is, our allies sometimes can be critical because we don't have playbooks, right? We kind of have a big idea, and then, so we use a lot of metaphors, but we'd say, like, doctrine is the list of ingredients, right? And our operational concept, whatever it might be, right now it's multi-domain operations. It's the type of restaurant that we chose. So, for the next 10 years, we're going Italian, wow, right?
You're making me hungry.
Right. But that's our theme, right? For our ingredients to play a role. And then our leaders are the chefs that are devising dishes and menus based on the available ingredients that they have access to. And so the more, either professional development, self-development, PME or whatever. But there's never been a limit, I don't think, in terms of what we allow leaders to do in terms of innovation. You're limited by your imagination, but it's the standards, right? It's the standards that you're trying to.
Yeah, and that's really important because certainly within the 4th Infantry Division, I'd love to have creative solutions applied, but all those creative solutions have to be compatible. And if one of my formations comes up with a great idea of doing business and it removes a capability off of my deck because, they've impeded either my decision space or they're hampering another. So you're exactly right. We do not put a constraint on creativity, but we do mandate that it all work together within the confines of accepted practice, at least, from a standpoint of compatibility.
It's got to fit into a coherent whole, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're an army that fights at echelon by formations, which means the next higher echelon is your formation plus a bunch of other formations. So everybody's got to be rolling the same direction. Which
is why we have people like you to help us with our doctrine.
But all of you brought up a few things, kind of resources and time. Want to talk maybe how you are trained back to, how you're training in 4ID at home station. So we're hearing a lot about warfighters. There's been a couple CTC rotations that are at the division level. And there's the project convergence capstone events. So some experimentation, creativity is going on. I'm curious, what sets your home station training apart from those kind of big events that we're hearing about?
Fundamentally, we have to be good at very simple things because that's how you build a combined arms team. And certainly I can talk about how we're doing that. I will say being in the Colorado Springs area affords us a unique opportunity to harness some exquisite capabilities that may not ever belong to a division, but like I described earlier, a division may benefit from being the recipient of certain exquisite skill sets. And so Peterson Space Force Base is within 5 minutes drive of Fort Carson. We interact with NORTHCOM NORAD on a regular basis. There are Air Force Academy personnel and Air Force experts who kind of come to our installation on a frequent basis. And that doesn't even talk about the Colorado Guard and some of the Marine Corps elements that are resident in the state. So we are trying very diligently to make best use of all those capabilities. And we've built a training approach so that at the division level, our staff officers are witting to that which is out there. And when we go through a multi-domain operations training event, we are putting into our military decision-making process the recognition that we should ask for these things. We should participate in the design of an operational construct that allows my boss or my boss's boss to recognize that they put these tools together within our planning cycle and we deliver the ground force, we can achieve maybe their purpose or the purpose above. So the proximity just makes it easy. And what we try to do is, if we're going to build a training event, we say, hey, if you want to come play with us, tell us what your training objectives are, because we'll write them into our design, and we'll go through the planning conferences, and we will ensure that you get your itches scratched. You walk away with value in the participation. But what we want to do is show, if you come play with us, if we participate in training together, you're going to be better served, and you'll be positioned to do whatever mission you have next in a better way, because you'll get realistic feedback and you'll get to practice communications and you'll get to do those things that you're probably going to be expected to do when the balloon goes up. So that's happening right now with the fire support coordination exercise that will integrate all these different capabilities. And then we go into a division field training exercise. We're trying to harvest some of those same things. Again, not as an experiment, but to be practitioners, actual executors of multi-domain operation concepts.
I couldn't have said any better, sir, than you have.
We'll talk about the fundamentals, the things that we have to do to make sure that we're active participant in multi-domain operations.
No, absolutely. So, looking at it from, all the different units and the capabilities described that are around Carson, that serves many purposes. One, the educational piece, what you can bring to bear to the fight if the need arises. Really the exposures to soldiers and NCOs and really officers alike as to all the other units. And it's good. It's good for the Army, one team. But really, when it gets to what we're going to do in Lethal Ivy is bring in these capabilities and real-life effects where we can actually learn and adjust. So they're not just concepts in a computer game that are fed through some system. We're actually exercising, and we're able to say, "But that does not work. Let's stop." Hey, so what do we learn from this? What is the gap? What can we create, or what's out there, commercial off the shelf, that we can test, and then feed that back through the Army system to make the force better?
You're creating apostles, MDO apostles.
I hope so.
Yes, sir.
If they see the benefit and they understand what is being done for them, then as they progress in their careers, they'll be on the lookout for that, and they'll understand how it all fits together. If we don't do a good job of communicating it, though,
Sure,
they may not see it, they may not understand it, and therefore they may not have the same amount of respect for that which is being done. I know the command level sees this, because the knife fight that's out there for these exquisite resources is brutal. But those are done in an operational construct. In some cases, in not conflict, but a crisis, and a lot of cases in competition. We want to practice conflict. We want to see how that all fits together when it's really substantial, going back to a threat that can really give us a challenge.
I'm going to go back to what you're saying, General Doyle, about in that creativity conversation about time, and that's what's so limited. So that brings up, I think, the conversation about senior leader role and prioritization. So I'm going to throw some doctrine out at you. So FM 7.0, this version actually talks about and addresses senior leaders. So it says commanders and senior leaders are critical to ensuring training is effective. They focus on unit training efforts. And then the other piece of doctrine I want to bring in is the training management cycle. So the cycle starts with the process of prioritizing training. So given those two pieces about senior leaders and prioritizing training within the training management cycle, I would like to understand how you prioritize training for your formation.
This is maybe the most difficult thing I've had to struggle with in division command, because for a generation, I learned you never prioritize your meds. Your meds were given to you. Oh, by the way, get them all done. Your mission assisting tasks were derived from the mountaintop given to you on tablets of stone, and therefore, barring your willingness to get fire, you better be a T at everything by the end of the training period. And I don't think that's realistic anymore, nor do I think it's necessary. And what I want to engender is a culture where people trust one another to be candid. And General Pappas has been adamant about this. He says it is impossible for our Army to achieve the same levels of training that it did previously because we don't have the same number of people that we did previously. So therefore, you're making things up if you're saying you're hitting every single training task to the same degree of proficiency, because you don't have the grade plate. Even within the rules of our readiness system, it's physically impossible. So if we continue to report that we are T's at all these tasks, we're fooling ourselves, and therefore we are hiding risk. And so what I tell my brigade commanders is don't hide risk. Advertise risk. Let me be the decider on risk. So I've told them we're going to have this dialogue on what I want you to do, and more importantly, what I want you not to do. So that dialogue now, I think is starting to take hold. I mean, you can sample the population and see if it has resonated, but I'm telling them what not to do as much as I am telling them what to do to therefore prioritize their efforts. And it's countercultural. I mean, you get a lot of folks who don't believe it. What was that company commander who was telling me that at our town hall that he doesn't believe that his squadron commander is going to let him do it? I was like, yeah. And so I had to say, it's like, listen, you have to communicate that to your squadron commander, that which you can do and you can't do. And then you guys have a dialogue, and then it works its way up. So it's I don't want to say it's an experiment. We are doing it, but it is definitely, it's a new experience.
I was in 2ID when go to the first, they had, because of the GWAT, people had gotten away from QTBs, quarterly training briefs, so they reestablished them while we were there. And I was in battalion command, and I was always like second to last in the briefing order, which was good because the guy who went first usually had a rough time. And so RCG sounded very much like you do, sir, and I think what you're about to share with us, Sergeant Major. But when they didn't get halfway through their medal crosswalk before he's like, no, wrong, incorrect. There's no way you guys are T's. So if you came in here thinking that my expectation is everyone's a T, then you misread me, and you're contributing to a professional culture that's corrosive to our military ethic, and this idea of, essentially, you're creating hollow units, right? Because you're not telling us the truth. After that, we never had that problem. I mean, people would actually bend over backwards to explain why they are maybe a P or P minus, or or where are you? But we're going to work on this. And then you had the real conversations about resource inform. What can I actually do with the resources I have that, putting people on top.
And then you solicit meaningful help. The boss, you want me to do this, I either need more time, more ammunition, more people, more X. And then the commander, he or she says, no, you're not going to do that because I'm not going to give you those things because I'm going to use them elsewhere based on my understanding of what my boss wants and what my unit has to be able to achieve. So there's a much more, I think, rigorous and rich dialogue on risk and risk translation when people are willing to lay it out on the table more candidly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was an article a long time ago that I read as Lying to Ourselves, right? And Mr. Creed, you started talking about culture, and I think that is the biggest difference. In 27 years, I've heard this over and over. Commanders saying, hey, you got to tell me what you got to take off the calendar. Hey, you don't have to fill all the white space. But, yeah, it still happens. I think the difference here, and we've experienced it, we're actually doing it. During the CADD, we took a look at some of these training calendars and asked commanders to look at, tell me how you were accomplishing this. And then they realized that, they're truncated their timelines, and we just know, one, the lack of personnel, that's going to drive your T. That's the way of the future. At some point, it will change and we'll go back. But for the first time, I think General Doyle has created an environment that, gives a little psychological safety for these commanders who, quite honestly, they're very competitive and they want to be battalion commanders. They want to be brigade commanders. But he said the conditions for them to show up to the table and say, this is what I can accomplish with the resources and the people I have. and I need you to underwrite the risk on what I'm not doing. And I think that's worked out really well in the previous set B we had.
Yeah, and that really came from feedback from when I was brigade commander. One of my battalion commanders told me, in fact, Chris Landers, with whom you worked, he said, "Boss, the way you can help me is not to tell me all the things you want me to do, not even to give me a list of priorities, but tell me that which you want me not to do. If you tell me that which you want me not to do, I'll figure out how to get the rest of it done, because you will have then made explicit where your risk margin is."
Sure.
And I guess it took me a while to figure that out, but once he laid it out like that very simply, it made me feel a lot more, I was more compelled to take that ambiguity away from my subordinates.
I absolutely love that, candor, honesty. So I appreciate what you guys are doing.
Well, we're making the effort. I suspect it'll take some time to persuade people that we're serious about it. But my boss has been really forthright because he understands, and Joe Bernabe really gets it, having been a CTC, COG, and seeing what units bring to the table when they show up saying they've done all these things and they really haven't. So I feel very confident that both the Force Com commander and my corps commander believe in this. And so it's my obligation then to translate it down to my subordinates.
Well, I was going to bring up something the Sergeant Major said, maybe you did, sir, maybe you both did, but before we started this thing, which is, in a resource-constrained environment, you can never go wrong if you start with being brilliant at the basics, like the Sergeant Major of the Army said. And quite frankly, there are so many basics that don't require a lot of resources that you can really do a lot with a little. You talked about the 90s. I remember you needed a field grade officer permission to start the tanks in the motor pool because of fuel or parts.
You had mileage limitations, hours limitations.
Hours, all those things. Even at the beginning of the GWAT, we actually ran short on small arms, if you remember, here in CONUS. So you didn't have 9mm ammunition and 50 cal machine gun, if I remember. There were two big shortages for like a year. But they were workarounds on those kinds of things. You could get really good at other aspects of that. So I just wanted to share that because we didn't cover that here, but I take conversation between you all. I learned a lot.
Any parting thoughts? What did I miss?
Well, the opportunity to speak about doctrine is important because it's our common framework. It allows us to act as a profession. And the more input I believe the field provides to doctrine, the better the doctrine is that comes back, which allows us to engage collaboratively, not just between the institutional army and the field forces, but as field forces work together. Until such time as we really understand what we can do and what we can't do and collaborate effectively, we have to fall back on doctrine as that authoritative source that drives our behavior. And so the work that you're doing is incredibly important. And we are going to be consumers of it. We'll be critics of it. We will engage with you on it. And these kind of professional dialogues are very meaningful. So thanks for affording us the opportunity to join you today.
I echo the same sentiment. Hey, 10 years, 20 years from now, whether MDO is the Army's operational concept or not, it's one thing really remains the same. NCOs train individuals, crews and small teams, and great units are brilliant at the basics. That's the foundation of everything they can build on. And we look at China, we'll look at Russia and everything they may have that match what we have, but the one thing that they will never have is the NCO Corps. And one thing they will never have is the leaders and how we build leaders in the United States Army, which is the greatest force in the world. So thank you for letting us be here today. Appreciate it.
Just like writing new doctrine is a team effort, breaking doctrine takes a team. Without the Crew and Special Doctrine Division here at CADD, we wouldn't be able to bring you this show. Our production is coordinated by Mr. Ted Crisco, and our editing and sound is provided by Captain Wyatt Harper in 29 Pixel Studios. Please don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify podcasts, and follow us on social media at U.S. Army Doctrine to get updates on new podcasts, Doctrine Digest videos, and publications. Finally, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Becker, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.